Hi, I'm Frankie, and I want to make music with Linux. In this video, which by the way is going to be my very first ever YouTube tutorial video, I want to show you how I take a set of samples of an old 1980s analog drum machine and create a mapping for those samples for use in the drumkv1 virtual instrument. This also includes some quality checks on those samples. Next, I will reprogram some of the patterns stored in the ROM of that drum machine using the Qtractor audio and MIDI sequencer. And after that, I guess I just fool around a bit, create some tiny song and do a bit of jamming. Come with me.
One comment here. I make some assumptions on what you should know about Linux and audio software already. Specifically, I expect that your sound card or onboard sound device is installed and working properly. And I also expect that you have installed and know how to use the Jack Audio daemon and how to create MIDI and audio connections for it via tools like Jack Control. Finally, you should have a somewhat recent version of Qtractor and the drumkv1 package installed. Find the necessary links in the description of this video. If you don't know Jack yet, there are plenty of YouTube videos on it already that shouldn't be hard to find. By the way, all software used in this video is free and open source software. So let's dive into it. Okay, so here's the story. I like old drum machines with their synthetic sounds that are so far away from realistic drum sounds. They just stick out of a mix nicely, and they have a lot more character to them than standard acoustic drum kits, at least in my view. Now I want to have one of these old drum machines available in my Linux-based music making environment. Purchasing such a machine can be a pretty expensive undertaking, and I think for now and for the sake of this video, I would be entirely happy with just samples of one of them. So how do I go about it? First, what drum machine do I want to look after? I have settled for one from Roland from 1980, the CR8000. So this baby is now 40 years old. Here's a picture of one I once discovered in a restaurant nearby, obviously heavily used for quite some time. The CR8000 has got 14 samples, comes with 24 pre-programmed rhythm patterns, has some kind of programmability, adjustable volumes for some instrument groups, and a few more goodies. I never owned one though, so I took this from the web and by reading the user's manual. I hope I got it all correctly. Now I need samples of this baby. Google can help here, so I search for Roland CR8000 samples download, and pretty quickly I landed, say, this page from Bonedo, a German musicians portal. The article they have written here is a nice write-up of the device, explaining its capabilities and providing a lot of sample patterns, and at the very end of the article, the Bonedo folks were so kind to provide a free archive of all the samples of this machine they grabbed, both individual instrument hits and also recorded patterns. Perfect. So let's download it. Notice I often prefer the command line to clickety-clicking with the mouse. It's so much more effective in many scenarios. Now let me unpack the archive I downloaded. As you see, it comes with some additional folder containing Apple-specific files that I'm not really interested in, so I'll just delete this folder. What I'm left with now in the Einzelsamples folder are the individual instrument samples. Let's quickly listen through them. Notice that the file names give us a hint at what they contain, like kick drum, claps, conga, and so on. Next, here is a quick check of the samples in the preset patterns directory. I'm not going to use any of these though, since I want to program my own individual patterns. Now, while this all sounds good to my ears, I need to check a few things. For instance, I have come across older free sample libraries where the sample rate of individual files was just, say, 11 kHz, which would be pretty poor by today's standards. To inspect my WAV files, I use the Sound File Info tool from the Sound File Programs package. Let's look at the first one. Alright, so this is a one-channel file, and it got recorded at 44,100 Hz and in 16-bit resolution. Okay. Next, I was planning to warn you about the channel count of a file. Like sometimes people record those drum sounds as stereo files, even though the drum machine just emits mono output. This could make handling of a sound, like panning left or right, difficult, and you would first have to convert such files to mono using tools such as SOX, the sound exchange tool. As an example, see here the Kong High Slap file from the CR8000 sample kit is obviously a stereo file. Is that a problem? It might be, depending on the tool you try to import it into. However, I noticed that in drumkv1, an imported stereo file silently gets converted to mono, and can then be panned in the stereo field to wherever I want it to be. So, as long as you plan to use all your files as mono files anyway, no worries here. But if you want to play back real stereo files, I suggest you don't use drumkv1 for that purpose for now. You can always create pure stereo audio tracks in Qtractor and import stereo files into them anyway, and they will then really be played back in stereo too. Next thing I would typically do now is to check that the samples are trimmed correctly so that they have no lead-in of silence at the beginning and also no excessive silence at the end of the sample. While extra silence at the end of the sample is no big issue, it just eats a bit of disk space and main memory, extra silence at the beginning is a serious problem. Why is that? Well, you would have a delay between the moment you press a key on your keyboard to trigger such a sound and the moment the sound actually becomes audible. This is very irritating if you wanted to play such drums live on your keyboard. Also, if you combine such a drum track with other tracks later on, those bad samples will appear to be played somewhat laid back, which might be okay if you actually want it, but there are other ways to achieve that later on. Initially, everything should be tight and exactly on the beat. Let me show this with two random examples from the downloaded data here. I use the Audacity sound file editor to open the kick drum sample, and if I zoom in a bit, you can see that the audible part of the sample really begins right there at the start of the file. That's great, this was prepared carefully. Let's take another sample, the snare. And again, when zooming in, this looks just fine. There is a tiny amount of unused samples at the beginning, but this is in fact less than 1 millisecond, so nothing I'm concerned about. You can also see that this sample has been recorded at a slightly too high level. There is zero headroom left here, and likely a bit of clipping happens at this point, so this could be audible as a slight distortion later on. However, in playing back the sample isolated, I found nothing that would disturb my ears. In contrast to that, to show you a bad example regarding trimming, let's take a look at some other file I found on my hard disk. Here there's obviously quite a bit of excessive silence at the beginning. In this case, I would simply carefully cut off that part and perhaps add a very short volume ramp, a fade in, at the start of the sample so that it doesn't start with a click sound. Similarly, if a file ends very abruptly, with the last sample being far away from the zero line, the middle line, you would likely get a click when this is getting played back. In that case, consider applying a short volume ramp, a fade out, at the end of the sample. It can be as short as 1 millisecond. Also, since this file appears to be recorded at a rather low level, you can see this from the headroom between the loudest parts and the upper and lower limits of the range, I'll perhaps apply the normalize function on it, which will make it sound a bit louder. This doesn't improve the quality though. You cannot really repair what was done wrong in the recording phase. However, the sample might simply come out a bit louder. Cool. Well, since the actual CR8000 samples I downloaded appear to be okay, let's think for a moment about how to arrange them on a keyboard. Here it makes sense to follow the general MIDI standard, which provides this layout for drum maps. So we would put the bass drum on the C2 MIDI node, the snare goes to D2, and so on. Here's a table I came up with for the 14 samples that are in the archive. At this point, we are ready to create the mapping for drumkv1. To do that, I first launch the QJack control application and start the jack daemon from there, and then I fire up drumkv1. This is the standalone version of drumkv1, by the way, but later on we will use the LV2 plugin version of it as well via Qtractor. The standalone version and the LV2 plugin both take the same mapping files as input, of course. So I go to the vertically arranged mapping table over here, click a key, then double-click in the waveform area and provide the file I want to assign to this key. I'm starting with a kick drum, which we said we want to map to MIDI key C2. I can now directly click on this key over here to hear the sound. Wait, no sound coming? Of course, we haven't created the audio connection between drumkv1 and our sound output device yet, so let's do that over here in QJack control. Good, so now here's our kick drum. There are typically a few settings I tweak in every sample I load into drumkv1. First, I set the volume to 100%. Also, I adjust the amplitude envelope over here to not have any early attenuation of the sample I'm playing. Otherwise, for instance, a crash cymbal might already get faded out by drumkv1 before it has been completely played. And finally, I check that I have a bit of velocity sensitivity for the sample. While drumkv1 has no notion of velocity layers, it's still a pretty basic sample after all, I can still fake that a bit by influencing the loudness of the sample via MIDI key on velocity. Setting this value to 100 will mean there is no influence by the velocity on the output volume of the sample. Giving a value of 0 means maximum influence. The best value is somewhere in between, so I'll go with 50 for now. I'm adding a few more samples to my mapping now. I'll not go through all 14 of them, this would take too long, and I guess you get the idea of how this works very soon. So we put the snare to D2 here, again adjusting volume and amplitude envelope, and then the closed hi-hat goes to F#2 and the open hi-hat to A#2. By now I'm able to trigger the individual drum sounds via mouse click on this virtual keyboard, as we've seen already. Now next, let's set things up so I can play them live from a MIDI keyboard as well. For this, all I have to do is to simply connect my MIDI keyboard to drumkv1 in the MIDI connections dialog of QJack control, like this. And I'm good to go. Alright, moving on, we now enter the realm of Qtractor. Let me first save the mapping I have created in drumkv1. It's a convention to give these files the name extension .drumkv1, so let's call this one cr8000.drumkv1. Also, I suggest you store your drumkv1 files in the same folder as your samples, or at least nearby, so this way transporting this dataset to other computers or places will be easy. I have repeatedly by accident deleted samples from my hard disk that I thought were not used anymore, only to find soon later that I had a drumkv1 file somewhere that referenced this data. Now I can quit the drumkv1 standalone app and will start up Qtractor. There we are. I create a new track, give it a type of MIDI, and using this dialog, I immediately instantiate a drumkv1 LV2 plugin in it. In this plugin, I open the drumkv1 mapping file I have created earlier. By the way, the next time you run the drumkv1 plugin or standalone app, it will remember your most recently used mapping files and offers them right here in this drop-down menu that is still empty at the moment. Now I want to create a very plain 4-to-the-floor pattern in Qtractor. For this, I create a new MIDI clip in my track like this. Alright, I have to first specify a directory for where this new project will live on my hard disk. After providing a project name, I now land in the MIDI clip editor. Let me zoom in horizontally and vertically a bit. If you don't want to use those tiny icons down here, you can also use the combination of Control key plus mouse wheel to zoom either in or out on both horizontal and vertical axes. Oh, and Alt key plus scroll wheel will scroll you left and right through your clip, which is also pretty handy. Then I turn on edit mode, set my grid size to half a beat, which is the equivalent of an 1/8 note, and add the notes. Kick goes into C2 as discussed earlier, snare is on D2, so we'll just have it on the downbeats. And the hi-hats I'm very blatantly putting on every 16th note, with just one open hi-hat at the end of the pattern. Now let's save this clip, go back to the main arranger window. Here I set a loop play range, then turn on loop playing, and voila, here's our pattern playing like a robot until we stop it. Now, next task. That CR8000 drum machine is not only defined by the sounds that come with it, but also by the included rhythm patterns built into the machine. There is a total of 24 patterns, plus some fill-ins, and I'd like to reprogram one of those patterns. Fortunately, in these old machines, the rhythm patterns were often part of the printed manual that comes with the device. Let's use our friend Mr. Google to find the manual for this box. Here we are. Scrolling through the document, I in fact find on page 14 and beyond these rhythm patterns. So which one would I go for? There, Rhumba. That sounds good and will perhaps come pretty cheesy. Good choice. Back into Qtractor. I've just replaced the previous minimalist mapping, which had just 4 of the 14 samples, with a complete version, so I can now play the remaining instruments on my keyboard as well. And now I'll simply go through the instruments of the sheet one by one and enter them into a MIDI clip. So, there we are. This is what the plain one-bar pattern sounds like when played back in loop mode. Not bad, but you notice that the pattern sounds pretty robotic. This is certainly not how a real drummer would play it. Now, the original drum pattern has accent markers on some of the beats up here. So beat number 1, 9 and 13 should be accented in both pattern A and B. This means that they get played out slightly louder than the rest in the original drum machine. I simulate this by modifying the key on velocity for these MIDI events. Remember that we made all instruments to be slightly velocity sensitive in drumkv1 when we created the mapping. I use Ctrl-click for multi-selecting all of the affected notes and then increase their velocity by dragging up these bars a bit. This already sounds a little less monotonic. So I want to duplicate this clip a few times to fill some 8 bars. I select the clip, press Ctrl-C for copy, then press Ctrl-V for paste, and place the new clip next to the old one, and then once more, and once again. Good. Now in the last of these 4 copies I want to insert a small variation of the drum pattern, like a tiny break or fill. Before I can do that, there is one problem right now, which isn't really a problem, but rather a behavior of Qtractor you should be aware of. What I have in front of me here is in fact not 4 copies of the same clip, but rather one clip which got linked into 3 copies. This is indicated by the dashed line around the clips. This means that if I make a change in one of them, I change them all at the same time. See here, I move around one note in the first clip, and the change becomes visible in the other 3 linked clips as well. This is perfectly fine for the first 3 clips, since I really want them to play the exact same pattern, but since I want to alter the last clip, I have to break up the connection there. I do this via right-clicking on that clip in the arranger window, and then select Clip and Unlink. Now I can apply my small conga break to the last of the 4 MIDI clips. There we are. Next, at the moment all CR8000 instruments are getting played back from the dead center. They are mono samples after all, and we have not changed their panning position so far. Let me do that now, at least for the toms. I pan the high tom a bit to the left and the low tom a bit to the right. The best way to hear the difference is perhaps by listening with headphones. It's not a dramatic change, but it certainly helps a bit. Now, the experienced musician will have noticed that there's something broken with this setup. At the moment, all instruments I play through this plugin sit on one Qtractor track, and that means they all go through one channel in the audio mixer. If I apply an effect in that mixer channel, all instruments are affected by it. However, in a realistic drum kit, you will want to treat your instruments individually. For instance, you will perhaps want to apply a compressor to your kick drum, shape the hi-hats a bit with an equalizer, and make the snare bigger by adding a reverb effect to it. This is not possible with the setup I have here. The solution to this will be to create multiple tracks in Qtractor, add a drumkv1 plugin to each of them, and only play one or a few instruments per track, and then apply effects to just that set of instruments on that track. However, this will be subject of a later video. Wonderful! I'm happy with the results so far, so I can now actually go wild and add some more tracks to this. I start off with a bass. My initial plans were to go with a bass from a hardware synthesizer, but then I realized I should perhaps stick to a free software-only solution, so I went for the monosynth plugin from the Carve Studio Gear suite. I choose the Fat Bass preset, which sounds like this, and I make a few quick modifications to it. I turn down the transpose values for both oscillators by 1 octave, and have the second oscillator use a sine waveform. Then I change the overall cutoff frequency to around 50 Hz and reduce the resonance since I want the bass to really only cover the low frequency range. Finally, on the modulation tab, I change the decay time for both envelopes and reduce the influence of the first envelope on the filter cutoff. So here's my finished bass. I'm adding a simple fifth and octave walking bass pattern to a new track based on E minor. Now I fix up the recorded clip a bit, quantizing the note onset and extending two short notes slightly. Also, I create a copy of the clip and attach it at the end. Next on the list, I need some pad chords. I instantiate the Yoshimi software synthesizer in a new track. And switch to the Will Godfrey collection bank, where I pick patch number 67, Smooth. Again, a few quick modifications. I add a few more higher frequencies on the 16th partial and reduce the frequency spread up here just a bit. There is my new pad sound. And I add a few chords to this track. Again, I fix up note onset and length, and I also increase the note on velocity for notes that I play too softly. Yeah, and that's more or less it. To come to an end, I'll just be doing a bit of piano tinkling on top of all of this. Well, there we are. We have a small, reusable drumkv1 mapping of this Roland CR8000 at hand. I hope this video was useful. Let me know what you think about it in the comments, and see you in the next one, sooner or later.